This movie was fucking terrible. Come on DC, I had faith in you this time around, because in 2019 you had an amazing year having two critically acclaimed films that for the first time were better than most of what Marvel had in store. But instead of learning from that, you decided to revert back to the quality of your other DCEU movies and only take away the bare minimum of what worked about these two, like incorporating more comedy and having an MA rating. Now, okay, that was kind of an over-exaggeration. This film isn't as bad as Suicide Squad or as boring as BVS for that matter, but as an overall product, it is an unenjoyable mess. The movie, though having a more consistent structure and tone than Suicide Squad, still managed to feel incredibly choppy and narratively all over the place. This is mainly due to the film's bad editing and the screenplay's lack of focus. This film tries to act like a standalone Harley Quinn film and an origin for the Birds of Prey, but in execution both plots feel like two different movies glued together. I didn't feel lost with how they structured the movie, but the way certain characters and plot points are presented resulted in a confusing narrative that feels overly stuffed with underdeveloped content to appeal to a wide audience. And karma dictates that it really hasn't been doing that well with that wide audience. The acting was really bad from a good chunk of the cast, and the only two actors I would say were good were Margot Robbie and Ewan McGregor. Besides their performances not being that great and leaning more towards incredibly mediocre, it was clear that both of these actors were having a lot of fun with their roles. A bit like Jim Carrey from Sonic. Black Mask is one of my favourite Batman villains and one of my top contenders for a DC Black adaptation, if they're ever going to make any others. And McGregor, though not amazing, did play the part quite well. I like the fact that he's very materialistic and somewhat flamboyant, which makes the homosexual aspect to his character feel more natural instead of having it be used to push an agenda. I think he has some funny moments, and his performance exudes this very likeable charm which makes him way more memorable than any other DCEU villain. But in reality, there's really no competition. Now moving on to Margot Robbie, she was actually not only the lead actor but also the producer, and she is really trying her hardest in this, and it does show. Before I saw this, I always believed she had the ability to play the character, and it was more Suicide Squad's screenplay that fucked her over the first time. But in this, she is much more natural. She has some funny moments. I think the screenplay concerning her was quite well done in many scenes and fit her character, and she had way more personality than any other protagonist. But in saying that, many jokes didn't hit, and she could get me on the verge of ripping my ears out in a few scenes. But overall, it is a much better adaptation of the character, and I hope Robbie can keep the momentum going with the Suicide Squad next year. The other actors in the film range from passable to downright awful. Mary Elizabeth Winstead was fine, but her role was very underutilized and her lack of screen time never allowed her to really shine. Journey Smollett-Bell wasn't that bad either, but nothing memorable came out of her character. Like at all. And Chris Messia's portrayal of Victor Zsasz was quite bad at points, but also quite faithful in others, mainly during scenes of violence. But everyone else was complete garbage. Rosie Perez looked like she did not want to be there. Her performance was bland and her character was even blander. She was so bad that at points it reminded me of Michelle Monaghan's performance from 2017's Sleepless. And if you don't know, it's one of the worst things ever.
Good, so you know I have to get back to work. I have to figure this thing out. Because this city is crawling with dirty cops.
And Ella J. Basco was just a typical shitty child actor. I'm hoping she gets better roles in the future, but her lack of energy and stilted delivery made her a very unlikable character, and I was never invested in her story. Unsurprisingly, the CGI was of course really bad. I have no idea who does DC's visuals, but the DCEU has consistently showcased very lackluster and cheap looking visual effects. Even in their good film it wasn't that great. But for this type of narrative they didn't need tons of CG, as its structure and tone is much more akin to something like a Marvel Netflix series or Joker. And though the more action-oriented stuff looks fine, it's the environment that's really distracting. The movie takes place primarily in the East End of New York, so comparing it to other DC films, it is on a much smaller scale. But the production design that incorporates CG like Ace Chemicals and the abandoned amusement park looked really fake and incredibly out of place. The buildings looked very 2D because of issues with lighting, texture, and composition. The fog effects never felt organic and felt more like an Adobe effects package. And the explosions in this film were just horrible. Again, not only does it look flat with no dimension, but its color and placement in the scenes never had a real presence and was super distracting when it appeared on screen. Aesthetically, the movie just looks ugly, and not in a good way. The lighting is very dark and unappealing, the cinematography was surprisingly very bland and didn't try to experiment or be utilized in a fun manner. The editing was again very bad and trying way too hard to be flashy and appealing. One notable moment was a weird out of context dream scene that felt forced in because they used footage that was plastered all over the advertisements, and it must have been shot separately because they couldn't find a way to organically place it in the story. But the worst aspect, and this is a first for me during an initial watch, was the sound mixing and sound editing, as both of these aspects were absolutely fucking abysmal. This movie gave me a literal headache, especially during the third act. There are parts where the mixing is wildly inconsistent, from the music tracks being way too loud to the point where you can't hear characters talk, to parts where you can see people playing instruments and no diegetic sound is being heard. During the final fight, the separately recorded grunts the characters make feel like each actor recorded 3 versions of that grunt and then they decide to loop them. But this is made worse by the grunts at times being way louder than the already loud music, which resulted in painful high-pitched jabs to my ears. And on the topic of sound, the music choices were also very bad. I thought they would have learnt their lesson after Suicide Squad, but this one kicks up a whole new level. The song choices range from unneeded and random to laughable and tone deaf. Songs like Black Betty are used in action scenes, but besides the inconsistent sound which makes it really soft, the inclusion is really lazily incorporated. If the action was more in sync with the music, it would have been much more fun and have a better point of being there. But it's quite clear they just needed a recognizable rock song to beat people up with. A lot of the songs in this film have that same feeling, but when they decide to become atmospheric, they do one of my favorite cliches. They get a pop song, and they rearrange it to make it sound more serious and epic.
Hit me with your best shot.
And I loved it, as every time it came up, you could not take anything seriously. And the best part is, it made up a good chunk of the soundtrack. Now, before I end this off, I just need to think over anything else I liked about this movie besides these 2 actors. Well, the animated opening was pretty cool and fun to watch, which led me into a false sense of thinking this movie was going to be good. I like when McGregor put on the mask. The roller skate fight scene was alright. So to end this off, Birds of Prey is a bad movie. It takes broad elements of what previously worked about more successful films but doesn't utilize them to their full potential. It's a disappointing, forgettable, annoying, headache-inducing mess that I have no intention of ever rewatching. Likewise, I have not seen BVS or Suicide Squad since their release, and this one can go directly in that same dumpster.